Ladies and gentlemen, thanks again for joining us. This is the breakaway session taking a look at developing healthcare facilities on the African continent. I do understand we had a vibey conversation about Cameroon a moment earlier. If you are joining us for the conversation on healthcare development, please do stay seated. Please do join us. However, for those of you who would like to engage further, we encourage you to use the networking facilities in the exhibition center. Very politely so, though. We are not chasing anybody away. For our next conversation, please allow me to welcome our two speakers, Anish Dwarkabashat, Development Manager at G5 Properties, and Yaku Nal, Senior Project Manager at Profika, Project Management Profika. It sounds as though my Afrikaans is a bietjie meer ordentlik. Nee. Gentlemen, come on stage and join us. Thank you so much. What we'll do for this particular feature, ladies and gentlemen, unlike the major plenary sessions that we've had, what we try to do here is encourage a lot more participation and conversation. So whilst our guests on stage are fundamentally the experts in this particular field and engaging with you as well to understand the status quo and lay of the land when it comes to developing healthcare facilities on the African continent, we do strongly encourage you to pick their brains, ask questions, and that's the whole purpose of today's conversation, for us to have a lot more engaging conversations and addressing pertinent issues that are critical to the decisions that we make. So I'd like us to start off with an overview and maybe a correction as to how do I correctly pronounce your surname, Anish?
Hello?
It's on.
Yeah, it's working? No, I think you're good.
You think I'm good?
Yeah, I think
okay.
you've done a good job there. You know? Practice makes perfect, but I think your second try was perfect.
Second try was perfect. See what happens after lunch, huh?
Yeah.
We lose concentration slightly. But let's start off with an overview of the dynamics, and I'd like to start off with you, Anish, just getting an understanding of the environment when it comes to models and systems that are used when it comes to development of healthcare. I think so often it's not really viewed as a sexy sector to get in compared to retail, commercial, maybe even industrial, but what's the lay of the land like?
Yeah, in fact, you know, it's a very specialized sector. And in fact, what we have seen is, you know, there's, like you say, it's a concept. You know, it's not like one perfect model that can work throughout the continent. It's obviously based on country specific and also government specific as well. What plays a major role in this is your medical aid schemes. You know, some countries are well actually structured with that. And the other is your public medical say healthcare services.
I'm going to jump in right there because someone like myself who isn't necessarily involved in that particular space would think, but I wouldn't assume medical aids or the public healthcare system north of South Africa's borders would actually be sustainable and fit enough. Is that the case?
You know, probably it is, because as we unpack this actually interesting topic, we see that, you know, PPPs actually fit well within the government public infrastructure, you know, whereas the private sector investor, such as an investor who wants to, say, provide equipment and also want to offer back of house services, can actually fit well. And actually there's major spin-offs as well for the private sector when they team up with public sector infrastructure. You know, and yeah. But currently we see that basically there are two models that work well on the continent. And in fact, as a real estate, you know, developer focusing in healthcare, you normally team up with an operator who sees a market in a country, obviously where there's medical aid schemes, because obviously private medical facilities are more costlier than government facilities. So you take advantage of private subsidy schemes, you know, private medical aid schemes. So that model is basically a PropCo and OpCo relationship, and that's how you roll out, you know, private hospital development on the continent. There's not many of these developments taking place cross-border of South Africa. You know, obviously, like I say, it's dependent on revenue streams. And the other model is your traditional, you know, I'll say your public sector investment into basically your government hospitals, you know, and both of them have their pros and cons.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Yaku, let's come to you to get your sense of the environment and the lay of the land, just before we start actually peeling away at some of the highlights that have been described. Sure, let's will have to share the mic. The other mic will be used for questions on the floor. So at any time in the conversation, if there are any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and feel free to fire away.
I think a lot of the governments is seeing that the middle classes, there's an uprising or upcoming middle class that they need to provide for us as medical services is concerned. They're not really there yet because they don't have the infrastructure, and that puts them in a bad spot. So, the support from the national governments in order to get the facilities there for the people is the outstanding point here, and they're struggling to get that right. There is developments that's going out there, that's happening, but, unfortunately, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa has been left behind to a sense. There is funding that comes from everywhere in the world, that's private funding, government funding. I think the biggest trouble is to get these together in order to put the health facility there that's critical for the people. And the upcoming middle class that needs to be not just them, but to put health, private health and government health there.
You've both mentioned PPPs and opportunities across the continent, again, urbanization and growing population growth, which attests to this. But I want us to actually use practical examples and maybe speak into both of your portfolios. What kind of healthcare structures are these? Are we talking large-scale hospitals? Are we looking at clinics or other kind of facilities? And where are they located? And, what have some of the experiences on the ground really been?
So, you get your primary health, which is your hospitals, facilities, that's your big buildings. And then you need to get your clinical, and unfortunately, you can't have all of that in the same town, for argument's sake. You need to get it out to the people as well. If you look at the type of facilities or healthcare that's out there, even going mobile, like mHealth, and, there's apps that can give you an idea of what's wrong with you.
Not Googling a headache, huh?
Not Googling it. And that's taking it to the people. So your clinic and then your mobile clinics, that's around, that's not a fixed spot or fixed building. So there's the various models as far as those type of things is concerned that they need to decide, what's critical, put your primary healthcare in a spot and then take some of the services out to the people itself through the smaller clinics, mobiles and that type of thing.
Just to add to that, Jaco, in fact, what I've noticed is that the public, the public sector hospitals, the revenue streams are low. So in fact, government has to frequently subsidize the maintenance and the upkeep of equipment, and will also move in with a change in technology. But they find it very hard, and it's quite a challenge to do so. So with time, those hospitals get old, okay, and they get run down. And they didn't realize that, to keep up with technology and also to attract, say, more robust revenue streams, okay, they then tend to partner with, say, the likes of, and as you wanted case studies, you have General Electric, for example, having a fund that, pursues these opportunities. And General Electric, similar to Philips and Siemens as well, they all have funds that are penetrating Africa, and they partner with government, they provide their own equipment, and over, say, the long term, that's how the payback, is actually contributed. The revenue model is improved, and then the equipment suppliers get a revenue stream. But that is just one model. The other model, what I've seen, is that you have a government hospital, a large government hospital, which is really run down. And then government realizes, a PPP structure is probably the most suited for them, because government can't relinquish their asset and get into a sale and leaseback type of arrangement, which we'll actually discuss more in detail. So a PPP structure then provides an opportunity for government to say, fine, let's allocate a portion of this hospital to the private investor, and then offer a different revenue stream for private healthcare, okay? And then you also have shared services within a hospital. So you have public offering, and you have private offerings, and then you have shared services. For example, your radiology, your back of house. And those models also, have been working. So I think that's more or less how the PPPs can benefit government and also benefit investors penetrating the continent.
Well, we have a room full of investors and some who might be interested in some of these opportunities. Unpack for us further as to how it actually works. And you also touched on the sale and leaseback transactions.
I
Share
think-
some tangible examples that we can allude to.
I think let's look at, the returns on a private hospital development. In fact, what was quite interesting to note, financiers, they amalgamate the property development with the operational cash flows into one pot. Because a hospital is such a specialized structure, you can't actually convert a hospital into a residential block or a hotel, suppose it fails. So financiers, and in fact, just to mention, Standard Bank is actually very well down the road and have proven that model here in South Africa and also cross-border as well. They look at the cash flows of the life of the hospital, and then they say, fine, as an investor, don't expect a 10% yield in year one, unlike a commercial development, and that is how actually the mindset has to change.
So if you're not expecting 10%, give us figures as to what we should be expecting.
Yeah, in fact, like I think it was Brawl that mentioned earlier in one of the opening presentations, is that you got to consider, some leniency in your revenue stream, such as your first 2 years will be a rental holiday. In fact, many of you will think, oh, why must I invest? But then,
Sure.
there again, remember, when you get into a hospital development, you're in for the long term. Your first 2 years will be a rental holiday, and thereafter you can start a stepped approach to your revenue stream from year 3, say 10, 8, 10, 12%.
And does that typically develop into a J curve?
Exactly, So it actually allows the operator, to actually get going, because at the end, you don't want the operator to fail. You're actually in this boat together. If the operator fails, then you can't replace the operator. You get my point. So in fact, that's how the traditional PropCo-OpCo relationship will work here and also cross-border. I think we mentioned that about the government hospitals. The revenue streams are basically just to break even, and suppose there's a problem, you have government subsidies kicking in to build the hospital and also to invest government money to improve facilities. But governments, we know, especially cross-border as well, are constrained with investment, their own investment. So they're reliant on private sector contributions.
On that note, though, opportunities that might be developing across the continent, are we finding that from a policy perspective, from a government perspective, and even speaking to the occupiers themselves, that they are cultivating an environment which makes it, ripe for development, ripe for investment, and even if there are new innovative models coming through? You're worrying me, you're shaking your head there slightly.
In fact, we try and, I say try and means that every country has its own dynamics. We get into Ethiopia, we get into Kenya, Ghana, Ivory Coast, and we see the macroeconomic, or let's say government policies are not so relaxed to accommodate a PPP arrangement.
Sure.
And like I said earlier, it's only a concept we are talking about, and each country you'll see there's various dynamics. So I think it'll take quite a while for us to let this model unfold, and each project will be based on built on a case-by-case basis.
Yaku, you agree? You want to add some pointers there?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I wanted to mention, when you build a hospital, your medical equipment goes up to 30-40% of your building cost. So it's quite high, and in order to get your returns on that, it is a long-term investment. A lot of, as you said, that a lot of the governments needs to amend their policies in order for investment within the healthcare sectors. They're not aligned yet in order to be able to put the money down or put money into it and then attract investors as well.
Any countries getting it right, though, so far?
I think there's definitely some of them, I don't know names. But there's definitely, I know for argument's sake in Nigeria, there's a hospital going in there now, and they're getting it right. So, but again, it's not using local people or local guys. It's bringing people in from outside. And I think that needs to change as well, because the expertise are there within the country. It needs to be exploited and used and enhanced.
Another theme that we certainly want to explore, but just before we go there, because I want to touch on investment in healthcare development structures from a secondary perspective, perhaps in a mixed-use environment as well, where there's further participation of other sectors there too. But anyone with any additional questions so far with regard to the landscape, the environment, and of course opportunities that we do see. We hear Nigeria, where at least there's some progress taking place. You alluded to the likes of Kenya, where I understand they have Kenya 2030, if I'm not mistaken, the national plan there, where they're looking at other developments there too. Any of you keen to unpack or maybe even have some insight into some of these conversations, so that we can actually understand what the lay of the land is and where as investors we should be looking? You've got your hand up, sir? Sure, the mic is making its way to you.
Yes. My question is, what has India done, because India seems to have worked in this area of health, investing heavily on private health, and it seems to have caught Africa. Many people are shipping people to India. So in terms of investment, what is it that we can do in Africa so that we can replicate a little bit of the success of the Indian hospitals and the health system?
What I've noticed is that, countries like India, also South Africa, are enjoying medical tourism. And that is obviously due to the structure of the tariff structure to the end user. And I think a large component of this is due to, government subsidies, such as the manufacture and production of your medication. I mean, I went to India and I got very sick. Really sick, and I had to go to a local doctor, and I was just thinking, but I'm going to get a good service. The doctor charged me, at that time, I remember it was like 40 rupees. 40 rupees, I mean, if I divide it by 7, it tells me what's the value in rand. But I also got medication, and actually after 2 days, I was better, And it tells you how cheap medical, services are in those countries. So in fact, yes, to answer your question, going back to the individual countries, it has to be based on a case-by-case basis on how the government subsidizes medical services, And also, I think India, for example, produces a lot of medication, whereas the countries cross-border of South Africa, are the laboratories well established? Are they able to reduce the cost of medication? These are the questions that comes to mind.
Yeah, I also just want to add the shortage of medical staff that you do find within the African regions is one of the biggest problems. I'm not an expert on that side of the healthcare, but that's definitely a thing that they need to rectify, because if you've got the people in the country, nobody's going to fly out of the country. If you've got the facilities in the country, the people will go there and stay there. Similar with the manufacturing, as with medicine, the equipment, that type of thing, everything gets imported into the sub-Saharan regions. And similar with South Africa, but at least in South Africa, there's some of the pharmaceuticals that's been manufactured here. If you can duplicate that within the African regions, you're definitely going to have an increase in the healthcare on that side as well.
Fantastic. Hope you're happy with those responses, sir. Any other questions with regard to maybe lessons we can learn from other nations with regard to really driving the investment in the healthcare sector and developments there? No other questions. Well, we'll warm you up. There's still more themes for us to unpack and explore, and that's exactly what we want to get into now, the secondary investment opportunities, because as we know, with the rapid rate of urbanization and population growth in the sub-Saharan Africa, that obviously leads to enhanced opportunities for perhaps additional primary healthcare facilities to be built within maybe a residential structure, or if there's alternatives as well added onto this. Is this a dynamic as well that could prove to be quite fruitful as an investment going forward? Yaku, let's start with you, then we come to you, Anish.
Yes, definitely. I mean, if it's from a simple hospital, if you look at the staff members that's in there, they'll need housing. They'll need a creche for the kids. They need schools in the area, and it's not specifically just for them, but to enhance the area. You know, then you get back to just simple maintenance things, equipment, catering, that type of thing. So there's obviously the secondary things that can flow out of a simple building of a hospital facility. If you build a facility of 310 beds or 510 beds, you're talking about over 1,000 people that work in a facility like that. So there's definitely secondary items that can come out of it and that can enhance the area as well within where you construct it. So, you know, there's definitely positives out of that.
Positives out of that. Anish, you wanted to add?
Yes, sure.
Take your pick.
Yeah, in fact, how I will approach this is, you know, firstly, you need to get into a PPP arrangement with a government-owned hospital. Okay, and in fact, what happens there is government transfers the risk to you as an investor. Okay, now the land and the precinct where this hospital is situated provides lots of potential for residential development, also commercial medical suites. You know, you can just keep on adding on to that, even laboratories as well, for that matter. You know, and government will make available the land, and hopefully it's still owned, or it's owned by government. It can be provided on a lease basis, and put that into an SPV. Register an SPV for the precinct development. Okay, and you leverage on government's contribution into the SPV, so you don't have to obviously fork out funds for the land purchase. And yeah, and that's how you roll out a mixed-use development. But, you know, firstly, let's start with a PPP and get your foot in.
Get your foot in the door.
Yeah, yeah.
You had mentioned with regard to cost, and I want to pick your brain on it, because when I think of a healthcare facility now, that obviously cannot ever run out of water. It cannot run out of power because people's lives are quite literally at stake. What kind of cost impact does that have on the kind of investment that one needs to make when developing a healthcare facility? Because I'm assuming that you need to look at alternative sources of power, alternative sources of water conservation as well, especially on the African continent, where we know that there's a dire need for both these particular resources. Aku?
You know, I'm going to take some of the facilities in South Africa where we've got stable power, stable water,
Well,
for now anyway.
demand has diminished, right?
And you know, as far as the healthcare is concerned, if you're compliant, you're compliant. All right. But then you need to take the next step and the next level and to decide, you know, how far do you take this additional stuff. So there's legislation that you need to comply with to make sure that you've got additional generators or power and water storage, and then you can go another step on top of that. So, you know, it's an add-on cost the whole time because you have to be an island most of the time as far as your generation of water is concerned. Or your power and your water supplies is concerned, so that you can be sustainable for, say, up to 6-7 days at a time.
You're able to tell us numbers, give us margins. I like the numbers, right?
I think let me add to that. You know, what I've noticed is in South Africa, you can build a hospital from 1.1 million per bed up to 2.6 million a bed. And the 2.6 million a bed is what you see in Sandton. Everyone knows Sandton Mediclinic. Now you go and roll out the same specification in say, Namibia, for example. Well, actually that's a good case study. We looked at least a 20%, you know, increase in cost. That is excluding providing, you know, a major backup power generation generator plant, or maybe, you know, additional tanks for water. That is just comparing the same infrastructure of country to country. You're looking at about, say, 3.2 million rand a bed cross-border. Now, if you happen to include, you know, the auxiliary, say, services, obviously it's going to be, you know, I'm sure quite to about, say, close to 4 million rand a bed cross-border, depends on country situation.
We did an exercise on a fuel cell for a hospital as the main power source for the hospital, and you know your cost, initial cost, is anything between 50 and 75 million. Your return on it will be 10 years, 15 years. So the initial capital is quite high in order to be able to do that. So, you know, but it's coming, it's like anything, it's getting cheaper eventually. but you have to fork out the capital up front. You're going to get your return, but it is an expensive exercise to be an island. Specifically, if you go into the sub-Saharan, you will have to need to be an island and self-supportive. You know, if you go into some of the countries where you need water supply, the water supply needs to be clean, so it's purifying of the water again. So it's another step on top of what you're already doing there, supplying the water. So yeah, it's a big capital outlay.
I just want to gauge from the audience if there are any investors in the room or developers who might be involved in projects with regard to the healthcare space. By show of hands, any of you? Have you, and I want to pick your brain on this, is this similar to the experience that you've had? Which markets do you operate in? What are you finding are some of the critical concerns that need to be addressed in the environment right now, sir? If you don't mind me picking your brain.
So I'm local, from Natal, and we've got a hospital license that we're putting up a hospital.
Is that the new hospital in Richards Bay by any chance?
No.
Okay.
No, it's not. One of the challenges that we've got is certainly the license is being steered away from the big hospital groups and rather put into the hands of smaller businesses and black empowered businesses. And one of our challenges with that is that the banks are skeptical of not doing business or doing business with people without track records, and that's one of the challenges we have. And again, especially when you talked earlier about amalgamating the whole hospital, the OPCO and PropCo together, it's challenging.
Yeah, in fact, I concur with you. What I've noticed is the banks look at an operator's balance sheet, to make debt funding available to the developer. And in fact, the type of items on the balance sheet is mainly operating income from a track record, not basically having, say, shares or probably assets, but they want to see operating income. So like you mentioned, very true. In fact, we had a situation where a bank turned down one of our deals because the operator on board did not have, operating income. But the balance sheet was very favorable, So I do concur with you.
Are there any other alternative sources of funding and capital maybe that you've made use of regarding the development that you're undertaking at the moment? And how successful have they been? And are there suggestions that you can provide as to how to make it easier to access this kind of funding?
Well, we're looking at mechanisms where we can strip out PropCo and OPCO separately and look at funding them differently. But yeah, I don't think there's any magic solution. I really don't. You've actually got to get people to take equity slugs in something that doesn't have a track record. So you've got to look at property development in and around the precinct to bring capital back to make the yield better. So we're finding it a challenge, we really are, unless you're coupled with one of the big three.
Healthcare facilities, that's what you refer to,
yeah.
hospital groups.
Yeah.
Sure. Anyone else in the room? Thank you so much, sir, by the way, for sharing your experience with us. Anyone else in the room with a similar story or similar experience would like to come to you, sir? The microphone in the front, please, sir. Just for us to get an understanding as to, what the experience is like on the ground and some lessons that we can learn and pick up from some of these themes. The microphone is on. You can go ahead and speak.
Thank you. So I'm from Zambia, and we currently developing a primary healthcare facility as part of a pipeline to then get into more tertiary type facilities. So we're faced with the same challenges as what has been alluded to by the speakers. But coupled with that is obviously issues to do with skills in terms of specialization. So we have a situation where almost all the major healthcare facilities relying on the same resources in terms of specializations. So obviously skills is a key constraint. Then we're also operating in an environment with a very shallow medical aid, or we call it medical insurance system. And obviously that's key in providing the affordability aspect for the operator. But to try and cure the value chain constraints, we've had to separate so we provide the infrastructure and team up with an operating company. And again, the expertise locally almost non-existent. So we've had to team up with regional operators out of South Africa to then operate the facilities. So those are some of the issues we battle with. And however, there are a lot of opportunities because we find that a lot of the specialist requirements in terms of healthcare require overseas attention. So you get a lot of people flying into South Africa, into India, even for things that can be provided locally. So the target is to try and capture that segment of the market. And if you look at it from that perspective, there is that opportunity. How then we structure it to get the best value is something we'll have to battle with.
Just as a side question, though, how long is this investment that you've made been around for? I just want to gauge with regard to the international participants that you've had to bring in, the challenges naturally that you've highlighted, how you are managing the J-curve trajectory that was described earlier on with regard to growth only picking up and investment return only being gained in the much longer term. Where are we in the cycle from your experience?
Yeah, so as you'd imagine, there was a lot of preliminary work that had to be done. Almost 2 years of work trying to get the project to bankable stage. We are at a stage where we've broken ground, so we have committed to delivering the project within a certain time frame. And the operating company has committed to offtake once the project is complete. We're looking at a turnaround period of about 12 months. So about 10 months from now, we expect that the facility will be up and running. Now, in terms of how we share the risk, ours as a property company ends at delivering the facility. And the operating company has committed to a certain lease rental. And so we've pretty much left it to them to determine how they will deal with the issues to do with cash flow and affordability. But I think Anesh also raises a very valid point in that the amount of work that goes into putting together healthcare facilities is so much that you almost have to, you're in it with the operating company in the long haul. So if the operating company falls into difficulty in the first year, unfortunately, you as a property company has to be a little bit more flexible in terms of how you structure your leases, and you find that you may end up taking a bit of equity an equity stake into the project to try and relieve a little bit of the stress that you would expect from the profile of cash flows that takes a little bit longer to take off. Yeah. So those are things that we expect, but for now, to get the project bankable, we've had to structure it in that manner where we leave the cash flow aspects to the operating company, but we are wary of the fact that it could get to a point where we have to take in equity.
Sure. Interesting insight. Sounds like it's like looking for a spouse, huh? You need to be quite critical about the decisions that you make in that particular partnership. But thank you so much, sir, for giving us insight. I do want us just to get feedback from both Yaku and Anish with regard to the two examples that we've alluded to, the conversations with regard to partnerships. And of course, it's a tough decision to go in there. But of course, it's for the long term and expectations regarding results. Yaku, your thoughts on what we're seeing from the example that the gentleman shared with us from Zambia?
No, I think it comes, if you go and look at the amount of money that is being invested through other first world countries into Africa, there's definitely funding available there. It's to get your hands on the money and to put the model then together that can work without putting risk. Governments doesn't want to take the risk because, you know, why will they? And if you can have the political stability within the countries, obviously there will be money coming in and flowing in. And that will assist with the type of dilemmas that you guys are sitting with. It's not easy. I don't think it's that easy. It sounds very much easy. But PPPs is probably the way to go because your risk is transferred. There's definitely funding that's available through government, through private partners, private sector. So it's just a question of getting to the right people, I would think.
Let's hope we invite government ministers here in the future. Anish, do you want to add?
Yeah, in fact, I just want to throw a curveball. I actually think, what I like to see working in Africa is a sale and leaseback structure. In fact, this structure has been extremely successful in London. And I see now with the aging infrastructure in the United States, it's actually a current topic of great discussion because, government cannot keep up with the upkeep, or obviously the maintenance of highways, and besides healthcare, So, but looking at the model that has been successful in the UK, it was purely on healthcare. Also Australia as well benefited from that model. But Africa, I have not seen any such structure yet successfully done. But basically how it will work is that government will sell, and this is the big question, whether government will change their PFMA, okay, and probably try and structure their procurement terms where they can sell or alienate, public infrastructure, so they sell it to an investor. In return, the investor pays government the sum of money, and then government obviously is committed to, say, ring fence a portion of that money to upgrade the hospital. So government can still retain as a, say, as a tenant in their own hospital, but it has been actually structured properly in UK, and it has worked. So hopefully we see more of those structures.
Any feedback from the audience with regard to the curveball that's been thrown by Anish? Anyone else with any other question? Okay, it's the 4 o'clock dip, right? Oh, we've got a question. There we go. Let's take your question, sir.
My apology. My name is Anton de Jong, ARC Architects. I was just wondering, I see some of these previous questions have remained unanswered, so possibly another one that will remain unanswered. I'm just wanting to know the concept of a remote diagnostic center, whether it be mobile or whether it be built. I know in Africa we're dealing with long distances, getting patients to medical facilities and the like. This semi-romantic notion has been mooted, and I just want to know if the panel or anybody in the room is aware of any success stories in this regard by which you have a centralized position where you electronically have specialists making diagnosis and thereafter deciding how to best treat patients. Thank you.
Well, I have not come across such structures, I think it probably requires greater private sector investment to formalize that structure. You're talking about remote, mobile. You're talking about mobile healthcare facilities, like what the United Nations roll out in the case of an epidemic.
Nobody can fund them.
Nobody can fund them. There's 50 of them.
Interesting. Maybe you can advise us further on that.
The
If you,
hard services and the soft services for the medical.
Please use the microphone, sir. So you're getting juicy now. We want to hear this clearly.
My name is Gary Hammer. I used to own a company called Into Africa, and I do all the hard services and soft services for hospitals, specializing in the cleaning side and the maintenance, specialized cleaning in theaters, autoclaves, etc. And the United Nations brought in close on 50 units about 5 years ago. They operated for about 6 months, and they refused to fund them after that. There's about 50 of them standing there, so if anybody wants them, they can go and get them. But nobody has come in after that again. No, they're not being used. They're not even prepared to sell them off. So the roads are too bad. I think if you've got something like a Unimog or something that can get into bad areas, that's the way to look at it. But they come in with these Iveco state-of-the-art panel vans. They equip them, put a doctor in it, 2 sisters in it, and off they go. They go away for 3-4 days. Sometimes the vehicles don't even come back. They've asked us to look at the equipment. We can't even repair the equipment because it's not made for those roads. They go into very bad areas, the Chokran areas, up from Beira areas. They go all over Mozambique. They really are standing now. They're not operating. I would not advise that gentleman. Depending if he's going into Africa, No. If it's in South Africa, yes. We've got decent tar roads still and you can ride, but some places you just can't there.
You know, in fact, I'm a real estate investor. I don't invest in motor vehicles.
Nice response. Do you have a comeback, sir? A response to? Delivering a service and sustainable? Patient flow through for specialists. Fantastic. Well, we are running out of time, but I'm glad that we did try to extrapolate some of the other pertinent issues that have come through. But as we wrap up, though, to both our panelists who are joining us here on stage, for those of us in the room who are looking to explore with regard to the healthcare services development and, of course, some of the other elements that come to play, what are the critical issues that we need to bear in mind before heading north of the Limpopo? Jaco?
We need a standard. They need to be able to design their facilities to a standard. There's various standards within the world, so it's available and it can be duplicated within Africa. Obviously, I think they need to speak to the big boys that's already in the market, that's available, that's got the knowledge, and see if they're willing to assist or to maybe join with them. It's out there and it's available. Let's use it because Africa needs it. So yeah, that's me.
Yeah, I think, you know, it boils down to the individual government, and I think government needs to regulate the medical, and I say regulate, I mean don't take control of it, but create some structures whereby they reduce cost and encourage their own doctors, you know, who qualify in those countries to remain in the country to provide that service. Because in fact, what we have seen, you know, the success of an OPCO in any country is highly dependent on the contribution of or by local doctors, you know. So an OPCO does not go and own 100% shares in any project, even here in South Africa. You know, at least 10 to 20%, at least 10%, you know, must be commitment and ownership by the local doctors. So I think structure, you know, is what's lacking cross-border.
Well, thank you so much to both our speakers. Clearly, I think a lot more research needs to be done in understanding the environment before you head into it, and of course, full preparedness and partnerships as you look to endeavor in opportunities with regard to developments in the healthcare space. Lots of opportunity, but I'm sure technology will also play a critical role in the future as to how this unfolds going forward. Thank you to my two panelists for joining us. Thank you to you for joining us and participating in this conversation. Just a heads up that the next session for the next 45 minutes, the hour in this particular room, room 2, will be Africa's hotel building boom. Is it real? So if you want to talk about all things to do with hotel investment, you can stay in this particular room. The next conversation in the blue room, which is room 3, will be around the insider's guide to construction costs and procurement, which we touched on very briefly here, but of course will be unpacked further in room 3. And in the yellow room, which is ahead of us, we're taking a look at funding for the Africa property businesses of the future, so alternative sources of capital. So feel free to join any conversation that you wish to participate in and go forth and conquer. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Much appreciated. Have a wonderful day further.